Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Youth Rights podcast. And today we are going to be talking about book bans, specifically book bans in Utah. We are here with Ty, who is a high school journalist who's actually writing about book bans. But first, I'm going to give Kelsey, who is another NYRA member, time to introduce herself real quick, and then we'll go into the podcast. You want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah. Hi, I'm Kelsey. I'm from Houston, Texas. I'm currently a university student at the University of North Texas. I'm an English major, so books are kind of my thing. So, you know.
Okay. Well, you want to go ahead, Ty, you want to go ahead and introduce yourself and just talk about, like the book bans and everything with that?
Yeah. So, hi, my name is Ty Noorda. I'm a student reporter for my high school's newspaper. I'm a 17-year-old and I live in Utah, which is why I'm here today. I'm really into the opinion category of journalism, so I've written stories like disadvantages of AI, overcrowding in local animal shelters, and finally book bans, which is why I'm here. As an avid reader, I'm really excited to be here today.
That's great. That's great. I'm glad. So, do you want to go ahead and talk about what inspired you to start writing the current article you're currently writing with the recent book bans in Utah and all of that?
Mhm. Yeah. So recently, the Utah Board of Education put three more books on the sensitive materials list, which means that they are taken from school libraries from elementary to high school in Utah schools, meaning that they can't have access to them. And that also means that if students bring the said books from home, they aren't allowed to talk about them or recommend them to other students. And they also aren't allowed to have them in the classrooms. Would you like me to talk about the policy itself, like how they go through and decide?
Yeah. Go ahead and explain that.
Okay. So if you go to the Utah Board of Education library website, they have different sections going over the overview, but they also have a section dedicated to sensitive materials. So you can go to you can see the list of books that aren't allowed in Utah schools, but you can also see the flow chart. And this is what the Board of Education uses they put the book through this chart, and if it qualifies as harmful for minors, they will take it off the shelves. The process starts with the parents. So the parents will, if a student has a book that they don't deem as appropriate for minors or other students, or specifically their own children, they can submit a form to the Utah Board of Education, and specific representatives will take these books through this review. So there's the initial review. So they ask the question, does the material present a plausible claim that the material is sensitive? And this is under the category of human genitals in state of sexual stimulation or arousal, acts of human masturbation, sexual intercourse or sodomy, fondling or other erotic touching of human genitals or public and pubic region. So they have this specific thing. So it's not talking about books that have different viewpoints or different diversity basically. It's more on the sexual pornographic side, in my opinion. I think that students should have free reign, especially if you're in high school. So if the book goes into this category of harmful, they will take it to a subjective sensitive materials review, and then they'll go into more detail, specifically like which parts of the book depicts these certain harmful context, and then they will send it through an appeal, and then they will report it to USBE, and then that's when it's reported, that means it's bad and it is taken off the shelves.
So when it's taken off the shelves, does that apply to every public school broadly in the state of Utah?
Yes. So it's taken off elementary schools, intermediate schools, middle schools, and high schools. So you can't find it in a school library. They will take it out and you cannot have access to it in the school library. However, it is still in public libraries and bookstores. So It's not banned completely from Utah itself, but specifically the schools, because they don't want minors having access to such content.
Yeah.
And you mentioned that they can't talk about it with other kids at school. Are they allowed, say they have a copy of the book that they bought, could they bring that to school, or is that going to get confiscated?
So it will get confiscated. One of my teachers, actually, my journalism teacher, she told me that our district specifically told teachers that if they see said books, they have to treat it like it is a knife and take it away and take it to the office.
Wow. So
Yes.
what would be like would the kid who brought the book like receive disciplinary action, or like what would happen with that?
I'm not really entirely sure. I'm pretty sure that they just get like a warning. They're like, hey, like you can't bring these types of books to school.
Mhm.
Let's keep it out of the classrooms. But I don't think they'll get detention or a fine or anything like that.
So I find it really interesting how they make it to where it's banned broadly. Like it's not just, oh, it's banned from just elementary schools or elementary and middle. It's like if it gets banned at all, it gets banned from high school, middle school, elementary school, any like, public school. So that's basically saying that high schoolers should have materials censored from them that they can read in educational context because it wouldn't be suitable for an elementary schooler. I kind of find that to be very weird about the policy of why like it's just so blanketed. What do you think
Yeah.
about that?
Yeah, I see your point. And I agree because censorship is a huge issue. However, the thing with these specific books, all the books that are being banned from Utah schools are depiction of sexual content. When it comes to like the books too, as other than the parents being the one to set in a form, if the book is banned from 3 or more districts in Utah, it is banned statewide. So if 3 districts, so if 3 like district or 3 schools or districts don't want the book in their libraries anymore, that can mean it's banned for all states. So if like a district in like St. George or Salt Lake and then in like Tooele all ban the same book, none of the schools in this state can have it.
So I guess that also poses the question, what's really the difference between a 17-year-old and an 18-year-old reading, I guess, a pornographic material kind of thing? Because
in my opinion, there's nothing really different. Another thing that comes up that proposes an issue is if a parent has a child that brings home these pornographic books from the school library, the school will be at fault. That's where it gets really messy. So
Mm-hmm.
and issues like that, especially just thinking about like banning pornographic material like that, not necessarily like obviously like the worst thing you could ban, but you think about like banning it for high schoolers is the kind of thing that once they're 18, it's now like fair game to read, to watch whatever you want. And that's what leads to severe porn addictions like that we see rising. So those bans actually do end up harming people more often.
Yeah, I agree. I think if you take away something from somebody, they'll be more likely to do what you took away. So if they are interested in a book that has been taken out of school libraries the moment they graduate, they're more likely to read it. However, again, it's to prevent danger for students, but also legal action with the schools.
I mean, I guess I do feel like that's more of the perspective of the schools is like they're trying to like protect themselves more than they're actually worried about like the individual students. I mean, that's just what I feel about it because I definitely feel like in high school, it's like especially if you're like 16, 17, like there's no problem with like reading something that may have like some sexually explicit scenes, especially because it's a book. It's not like it's a movie or you're watching like porn on TV. It's like it's just words. And a lot of the times there can be certain situations where that's extremely relevant in the context of a story. Like if they're like especially like if there's a story about like a sexual assault, for example, that's really it's like deep and meaningful to the story of the character and how like that affects them with like the trauma and stuff. That's just a first example off the top of my head. But I mean like that could therefore then fall under the category of too pornographic when realistically it wasn't just put in there to like be sexually gratifying to the audience. It was put in there for a purpose of like saying this thing that happened to this character affects them in this way, and I feel like it's a very serious thing that definitely shouldn't be censored from an audience.
I was just thinking, like, what happens when a student is, like, unfortunately sexually assaulted? It happens all the time. Sometimes seeing that in media is how someone knows what happened to them is, like, actually bad.
Mm-hmm.
If they're getting groomed, if something, like a predatory situation, they might not understand the level to what is happening to them, the negativity of what's happening to them. And this media can show them why it's bad and what are the resources available to them. It can show them to go to the police, to talk to trusted adult XYZ, you know?
I like that you bring that up, especially in Utah. I feel like that's really relevant because Utah is a very heavy Mormon community, very religious. And I definitely feel like in religious communities, they have a tendency to shelter young people from anything that has to relate to like sexuality, which they feel like, oh, they're protecting the minor. But in a lot of circumstances, that leads to situations where like if they try to censor them from like basic sex ed and stuff, if they get like assaulted or something, a lot of the times there's been cases where they don't even realize that that's bad. Like if a parent or like a person is doing like something wrong or inappropriate to them, they don't even realize the severity of that situation because of the fact that they've been raised in such a sheltered environment away from these things. So then when the media gets censored, that is just another way of keeping people sheltered from things that actually may not be a negative thing for them to be exposed to in all circumstances.
Yeah, I agree. I think that representation is a huge, it can mean a lot to the young people of like Utah and America as a whole. I think representation is important to realize that some things are okay and some things are not. However, the thing is with books in schools that depict that is it's not up to the schools to educate sexual assault victims or drug use victims about these things. I think that being a victim of sexual assault and underage drug use is important for youngins to see so they know what's going on. But again, it's not up to the schools to teach them that. But then again, you have to come back with the contradictory that censorship is bad, because if you're taking away media, we get on the line of like dictatorship, if you know what I'm saying.
I mean, I would disagree with you on the fact that you don't feel like it's school's job, because I feel like in a lot of circumstances, like schools are more like, oh, the parent should handle this. The parent should be the one responsible for, you know, teaching the kids about this and making sure the kids stay safe in these situations. But if there's like a parent or like very, very controlling, very sheltering, a lot of times there's been circumstances where they feel like instead of actually educating their kid on these types of situations, they just won't. They simply don't. And then when schools try to, you know, have like sexual education and then like drug awareness, like suicide awareness, they'll actually opt their kids out of that to be like, oh, I don't want my kid to be poisoned and hear all this information. But then it makes it to where if a kid does get into like, oh, a sexual situation or a situation with drugs, alcohol, suicide, anything related to that, it actually makes it to where they're unprepared. They don't know what to do. Like they could have negative consequences to themselves as a result of both their parents censoring them from the information, and then again with the bans not being able to receive that information in a school context.
I agree. I do agree with that. I do think that sexual education is very important. And that it is an issue where parents will pull their students out of that class, but then again, the class itself also doesn't teach very well, and I think that we need to improve our sexual education, especially with my experience with Utah, because I'm not sure how other states are, but I didn't learn very much growing up, and I'm a senior as right now. However, the problem with that is as much as I agree that school should be a safe space for students that don't have that at home, and I think that they should educate themselves through books, literature, media, whatever. When you bring in legal action, that's when it becomes a problem. That's why I'm like very neutral about something like this. When it comes to books that are censored for queer rights or diverse opinions, like people of color, like education, things like that, or even just like stuff revolting the government, I think that we should not be taking those away.
With that though, it's one thing to claim that the school isn't responsible for sexual education, all that, and that they have legal trouble. But it's one thing to not have a book included in any public school library. To say that a student can't bring the book onto campus, actively essentially punishing them for reading a book, even if they got on there, that's where I think the biggest problem lies. You're not.
I agree.
this book seem like reading it's a punishable offense for this child, and that shouldn't be the case. If you don't want to have that accessible in a school library for whatever legal reasons, that's one thing, but saying that a child can't read this no matter what, if their parents say it's okay, if they find it at a store and they buy it with their own money, and it's going to get taken away, confiscated like a knife, and all these situations, it's essentially villainizing this very human thing to these children. And also it's creating a group of adults that are completely unaware of everything in the world. And it's one thing for the school to not prepare them, but to actively shield them from being able to develop and understand the world around them is kind of sickening.
Yeah, I agree. With the article that I wrote for my school newspaper, I actually interviewed a sophomore, and she had very similar things to say. She said, from the school's library that's provided to the students, I think there should be regulations on that specifically. But what students bring from home, what they are personally reading, is none of the school's business. That's the parents' job. And I agree with her. I think that was a very smart thing to say, and I think that was a very fair thing to say, because it isn't up to the school if a student brings something that they own, and they shouldn't be taking that away unless it is like a danger, which it's not. It's a book. So it's like, that's why I'm like very neutral or in between, because I see why the school has banned these books, but I also don't agree with taking them away in the sense that if the student owns it and decided to personally read it, that is not your job to protect the student if they've gone out of their way to read it from home.
Yeah. And you know, it's I mean, especially like the confiscation, because it's property seizure, and I don't necessarily think that schools should have the right to like remove property from students, especially if they went out and bought it with their own money, and they own the property. Like, I feel like unless it's an actual like threat, like, oh, they have a knife, like, okay, yeah, that's justified, obviously. But you know, in situations with books, it's like, it's worse. The student is bringing it, they're reading it privately in the school, like they're trying to read, they're trying to learn. There's people who just prefer to like scroll Twitter on their phone all day and never pick up a book in their life. And it's like, and then you're going to sit here and you're going to punish a student for actively wanting to like learn. Like, I don't like see that. I don't feel like that's justified in any circumstance at all to do that.
Well, and I know this is not a credible source, but my dad, actually, I was talking to my dad about this, and he agrees. He thinks that we shouldn't be banning literature. Like, he, no matter who he resonates with or what he believes, he was like, out of a 300, 400-page book, there's one page that has sexual depictions. Does that really matter? Obviously, we shouldn't let elementary school kids be reading something like that, but as a teenager, those are normal things to experience.
Yeah.
So that's where it gets confusing, because, you know, one page isn't going to affect a kid for the rest of their life.
Yeah.
You know, so.
I mean, I kind of want to go off of something that Kelsey said earlier about the taking away the development from kids, because like there's definitely a way that, like, this is an example I like to use a lot. Like, I've heard a lot of people when they were little kids talk about how when they learned about like death, for example, like, oh, they had a family member die when they were young, and that was like their first ever exposure to the fact that people were going to die, and that was like a huge shock to them, and it like really, really got them. But for me, like, my parents never sheltered me from like the fact that like death existed, so it was always just like a fact of life. It was always just like a fact of like, oh, like the sky's blue, like the wall behind me is white, you know, like that's just a fact. So it wasn't a big deal when like, or it wasn't like a huge hit when like when a death happened. I mean, so I feel like that same circumstance could apply to a different degree when it comes to young people, not necessarily little kids, but like teenagers more so being like exposed to sexual content. So if you're a teenager who up until the age of 18, you've been sheltered by both your parents and in the school system now from any material relating to sexuality in any context, then when you suddenly become 18 and you're exposed to that information, you're allowed to experience that information without people sheltering it from you. That's like a huge hit. It's like, whoa, I don't like, this is so much. This is overwhelming. Like, I feel like that is like can have a negative effect on people.
And that's why I think representation is very important, because, you know, we read things every day, And representation is very important because then you feel seen. So if you have a character that doesn't really understand that kind of thing and then they learn about it, so does the reader.
Mm-hmm.
That instant exposure like that, in studies, it's proven to cause like serious like pornography addictions. And I mean, that is a serious issue. Someone just, when you see like things, a child who has no exposure to any like sexual education, anything like that, like, they just don't know anything about it. It's never like been taught to them at all. They've been opted out of every course and all that. At 18, if they're suddenly exposed to it, it's more than likely that they will develop an addiction to like pornography. And that's not something that schools should be kind of encouraging people to develop.
I agree, and it's unfortunate, but the schools aren't thinking about that, and they should, but they're not. Like, from a personal perspective, I just don't think that they're thinking that far. I just think they're like, oh, sex, that's gross. Like, students shouldn't be reading that. I don't think they're not looking into it as deep as we are. They probably are protecting themselves and probably thinking that they're protecting their students, and in certain aspects they are, but in certain aspects they're not. So like, I agree with what you said because the schools aren't thinking about that.
Yeah.
I guess my point is that they kind of should be. They should be thinking that far ahead. They need, because they're supposed to be preparing students, adolescents to go into adulthood and deal with like the changes, especially because like legally there's a lot of changes because of like the 18 adulthood legality of the whole situation. So with that, they're preparing students to be ready to reach that 18 point and be an adult and go into the world and be educated for it. If they're not thinking about how this is going to negatively impact the next generation, then they're failing significantly. And I think a ban of this level, to the point that they can't even bring the material, they can't even like admit to have read any kind of book with a sexually explicit scene or anything like that, that's negatively impacting the next generation.
Yeah.
I totally agree. And it does seem like schools are being selective. They're all about, oh, we're preparing these children for the future. We're preparing them for jobs. We're preparing them for all these things. But I feel like they're being selective. Because like I mentioned before, the sexual education that we have now, specifically in Utah, just isn't very good. And so I feel like schools are being selective with what they're teaching their students and preparing them for the future, which that's also not very good because that's what we've been told school is all about. But
And I do want to kind of go off of something that you said earlier about, you said that you're glad that they're, not censoring other types of information, like, for example, like LGBTQ representation and stuff like that. But I do want to say, not to, use a slippery slope fallacy or anything, but when we currently are in an administration, presidentially, and then, also the dominant administration that does, a lot of the people within it holds views that anything related to LGBTQ, queerness, gayness is inherently tied to pedophilia and to brainwashing of kids, which there's a lot of people within, the current administration that hold those ideals, especially, if you look at Florida, like with, who's his name, DeSantis, he definitely, has those ideals and then does put book bans out relating to that, like using that as his basis to say that, like, queerness is indoctrination, writing about that is indoctrination of young people, and it's inherently pedophilic, and it's inherently sexual, even though it's not inherently sexual, at least not in my opinion. So when it comes to book bans, and the book bans say, oh, it has to be including only sexual content to be banned, that creates a slippery slope, because it opens the door to, let's say there's like the people that would be in charge of doing these book bans then go and they say anything related to queer identity or queer identity relating to children is inherently sexual, which there are a lot of people who believe that. So it creates that slippery slope of, okay, now they're only censoring explicit scenes, but in the future, who knows? They could censor things just because there's a gay character, and they could say this gay character is inherently sexual and that kid shouldn't be exposed to that. And I feel like that's definitely a very big concern. And that's why, one of the reasons why I'm very anti-censorship in general, because I feel like a small amount of censorship always opens the door to a larger amount of censorship.
I agree. I do think it's very important that we recognize the difference between Utah book bans and Utah school book bans. Utah as a whole, or even like America as a whole, they have several books that are banned from all libraries that have queer representation, people of color representation, and disabled representation, like all these things. However, the schools themselves, like the Board of Education, has not banned books because of like queerness. And that's but then again, we get that slippery slope. How long is it going to take before we get to that point? There is currently 26. And I'm not familiar with all of them, but what this Board of Education has told us and what we know is that it is because of sexual content, whether we know it's queer people being sexual or not. But there are books in Utah as a whole, not just schools, that are banned because of queer people. And I do think that is inherently bad because, censorship, representation, like I've said, all these things. And so that's why I think it's important that we recognize the difference between Utah school book bans and Utah book bans. That makes sense.
I feel like that's a concern with censorship, especially, is that one thing could lead to another. And that's why I think it's better to cut off censorship before it expands, I guess.
All this kind of makes me think about how I'm not sure if it's just in Texas or if it's all over the US, but there have been cases of banning books and banning like certain like education materials on the premise of like depictions of racism and depictions of like
critical race theory.
Race theory, right? Right. So in these ideas that showing this will isolate white children and make them feel this kind of like victim complex because they're viewing themselves as like the perpetrators or whatnot. So it goes on to that idea that if you're depicted critical race theory, and then it goes into that kind of slippery slope ideology where it's like, and they start banning things that just depicted like racism because the white kids start feeling bad, XYZ, all that. But then when does that get to the point that any depiction of just minor racism that is an everyday thing for most people of color is something that you can't see in a book that children are access to read, or just people in general access to read? Children need to grow up and see what is happening in the world and know why they shouldn't do things like, I'm thinking on the lines of Utah. Utah is majority white, right? So there's probably kids at schools that go to a school that there is not a single person of color there, and maybe a very small town or something like that. Not a single person of color there. They only see other white people. So what's stopping them from when they go to a big city and they see that, there's people with different skin colors than me, different features, all that stuff? What's stopping them from being like scared of the different kind of thing? That's the ideology there. If you're not exposed to differences in other people and literally everything in what you see when you're growing up, you're never going to be able to comprehend it as an adult. Children are not so much different than us that they can't comprehend like that people are different, that sex exists, all that stuff. It's actually important that they comprehend these things, because if they don't comprehend them when they're a child, it takes so much longer for an adult to comprehend it.
Yeah, for sure. And
I agree.
And also with that, like, I feel like in general, so many people, especially adults in positions of authority, have this idea that if something is like bad, like I'm going to use bad as a very like just general term, that if it's bad, kids shouldn't be exposed to it. And a lot of the times, first that always involves sexual content, because that's easy. Like, you can get a lot of people to agree to that. You can get a lot of parents to rally up here and be like, I don't want my kids exposed to that. It's bad. And then boom, it gets banned. But realistically, then that goes to other things like, depictions of violence, depictions of drugs, depictions of alcohol, depictions of all these other things. And while I would agree, in a lot of circumstances, these things are bad, it's also good for kids to be exposed to information and media that does have these bad things. Because if you're not exposed to it, if you think you're living in like Peaches and Creamville, like, you're not going to be prepared for the world when you like enter it. And it's very crucial to like someone's development for them to be exposed to things, because you can comprehend them growing up, instead of just, like I've mentioned before, it just being a blast to you when you finally are exposed to these things. And I feel like that's going to have negative effects on people as they grow up. And I feel like definitely parents and the schools and the government don't really think of that. And they prefer to just do something because it's easy and it's popular.
All these topics that you listed, like the bad things that they don't want kids exposed to, that's primarily what bills are being passed on, laws are being passed on. That's what people are voting on. So when they are not exposed into it in their youth, in their childhood, and then they suddenly turn 18, they can vote, they can do everything, you're creating a generation of people who have never had time to formulate an opinion on anything that they're voting on. And you have a bunch of 18-year-olds who know nothing because we're not allowing them to have the ability to educate themselves. And they suddenly hear it, and then they're forming an opinion just based off what the first person's telling them, instead of having them have the opportunity to be educated and be able to be aware of the realities of the world and what they will be voting on, and how the government works, and what their opinions are, and how they want to be represented.
Yeah, for sure. That's a really good point. I'm glad you brought that up.
I think it's important that we teach our future, our children, the future of America, as people say, because if we don't, then it creates a false reality. So I do agree that we shouldn't be banning literature because that can create issues with censorship, but I also understand why, from a neutral standpoint, understand why the schools have done it, but I do think that they have not thought far enough as to the outcome of what they're doing.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, like I'm saying, they're just doing it because it's populist. It's easy to get people to agree to that. It's easy to ban things because of just the whole.
And that gets the worry off their back that things are going to happen if a student has access to a pornographic book, though, right?
Like, I mean, because they want to protect themselves and everything from the parents, but they're basically folding. I mean, I don't like the thing that it's like they're folding to censorship, because so it's like, oh, this parent doesn't want this kid to have it, they submit a complaint, now everyone doesn't get access to that. I feel like that's just extremely unfair. To, like, maybe there's one circumstance where, okay, a kid who maybe isn't that mature reads a book that depicts one sexual scene, and then it's like, oh, it gets to them, and then it's like it's all in their head. But I feel like in the vast majority of circumstances, I don't really feel like it's going to have like a profound negative impact on someone's life to where it's like, whoa, oh my God, I read one thing about sex happening. Like, it's just a disconnect. Like, I mean, of course, in elementary schoolers, that'd be a bigger thing. But when we're going into high schoolers, especially, like, I really don't see that that's an issue. Like, I just don't see how that can really get at people. So it's not really about protecting the kids. It's about the schools trying to protect themselves from angry parents. And I feel like when you fold to the angry parents instead of the kids who are going to be the ones being punished, that's just such an unfair policy to have.
No, I agree. Well, and you brought up how like 3 people, because what I said earlier, 3 people decide that they don't want the book and it's gone from all schools. If you look at this list, most of the schools on here are the same. Alpine, Davis, Washington, and Tooele are they're mostly on here because it goes from title, author, removed in the following districts, so that's why it was removed from all, and then where the title was like located, so like which grade level, and then the date when they pulled it from the shelves.
Wow.
And most of the districts that have removed it first are the same.
This is kind of tying back to what I previously said and something y'all said, but I feel like generally we keep going back to this idea that the reason schools are doing this is to protect themselves, right? But as I was thinking about it more abstractly, if you're thinking about how book bans are prohibiting education and censorship is prohibiting education of the youth, and then that's leading to a generation of 18-year-olds that can vote and they're uneducated about it and they are most likely going to vote the first thing they hear, that creates a kind of cycle that keeps the power of representation in the older people and the people who already have the power, so it keeps the power within them. It's almost, in a way, abstractly denying representation for this new generation of voters and these younger people. It's denying them proper representation and their rights because they're unable to be educated on what they're representing themselves on. They're being denied the ability to educate themselves.
Definitely, and that ties back to another issue that I'm very passionate about and I've spoken on before, which is social media bans, which is very similar to book bans, actually, because we live in an era where a lot of education, especially for teenagers and young people, come from what they read on social media, what they learn. Of course, there's misinformation, disinformation, but I feel like a better solution to those issues would be schools teaching like what are good sources and how you should educate yourself. But anyways, the point I'm trying to make is people educate themselves using the internet. People educate themselves using the books that they find in school. People educate themselves using social media. Young people do. That's how they educate themselves, because the important things that you're going to be learning, especially about the world and about politics and about like the current state of like real issues, that's not going to be coming from a school curriculum. It's really not. That's going to be coming from books. It's going to be coming from the internet and social media. That's where you're going to be educated about this. When the people start banning social media for young people, just like they've banned books for young people, and we saw this recently in Australia. I did a podcast about that where they banned social media for anyone under the age of 16. Again, very similar to the book bans, where they basically arbitrarily say that this group of people, based on nothing but their age, cannot have access to this information. So then it creates a way that people, like when young people, like how Kelsey was saying, they grow up, they're uninformed of these issues, they don't really know what's going on, and then they're more susceptible to manipulation, to propaganda, to all of these things because of the fact that they weren't allowed to educate themselves and they weren't allowed to be exposed to media, which has important things for them. So I feel like book bans, social media bans, all of this goes in line with you're restricting information from young people, making it to where they're unable to learn these things growing up. And when they get into the point where they are grown up, it negatively affects their life and it negatively affects their ability to actively advocate for their own rights and to vote and represent themselves.
I agree. I think that it's important that we have representation, like I've said. And like, again, as much as I see why the schools are doing it, I don't agree because I like with what they're doing, because just the cycle repeats itself, then we're going to be stuck in the same cycle of things that need to be fixed but aren't getting fixed, and things that we're fighting for aren't being fought for, and all these things. And so I think that it's important that we keep these books in schools, not necessarily elementary schools, because kids, younger children just don't have that sort of development. But as they get older, teenagers are more likely to comprehend these topics and take them and use them. Because like we talked about before, you come across something in a book that's shocking. You're like, oh, wow, that's shocking. But then you come across it in real life and you're like, oh, I read about this. It's okay.
It helps people be comfortable.
And I do
like
agree with
comfortability.
books that are being banned for unruly reasons. Like I think that there's so many books that shouldn't be banned at all, and I think no book should be banned, but specifically ones that are banned for stupid reasons.
I have a question to ask you. You may not know the answer to this, but have there ever been any cases of a book being banned in Utah and then later being unbanned, or the ban being lifted?
I'm actually not sure. That's a good question.
Because I don't think there is.
There's a possibility, but when it comes to book bans, they are set in their ways. Like there are books that have been banned for queer representation years ago and still are. Or like racism or sexual assault or sexual content years ago, before we realized that that's okay to learn about that stuff. That's okay. That's normal. That's what's really happening. But I'm not sure if they were unbanned and if they took a second look. I'm sure parents could put an appeal or like schools could as well. But I'm not really sure about that, and that's a good question.
Well, yeah, that's just kind of what I was thinking about censorship, because I feel like censorship only increases, and that's why I asked that, because I feel like when it comes to censorship, it only gets worse. Like I feel like there's very few circumstances where censorship decreases. Because you look at the internet, for example, when the internet first became popular, everything was out there, and there's only been more and more legislation to restrict that. And then same thing with these books. When they came out, no book comes out being banned. There's only been increasing amounts of book bans, and there's very rarely circumstances where books are unbanned. So I feel like the more we normalize this aspect of censorship, especially in an educational sense, it just leads to an increased amount of censorship, and it doesn't like get better, I guess. So that's also another concern that I would have.
But censorship is used as a tactic to keep the power in the small group of people, right? The censorship does not hurt older people 50 and up, as much as it hurts people 25 and below. That's the people who primarily need access to the media around them, whether that be books, movies, television, social media, any type of social media. That is what they're relying on to form their opinions. By censoring those things, they are trying to keep the power within that older generation that already has their opinions fully formulated and knowing what they want. And it eliminates the ability to diversify the power like we've seen in the past. That is the primary tactic of censorship, and that's why it's so harmful to the world in general, but also specifically to young people.
I like that. That's a really good way of putting it. I agree. We are almost at an hour, so I think we are gonna go ahead and wrap up. But do either one of y'all have like any last thoughts on censorship, on book bans, on anything related to that?
It's really bad.
Yeah, it's censorship is not good for the younger generation, and I think it's important that we fight against it.
That's good. I'm glad we're leaving off with that message. Well, thank you both for coming on, for taking the time to do this. It was great. I will hopefully get this episode out pretty soon. And yeah, censorship is bad, guys.